Good evening, good afternoon, and very late at night for some of our panelists who are going to be joining me remotely from the UK here shortly. Thank you for joining us for this discussion around the role of global standards and ensuring a high-integrity VCM, verified carbon market, voluntary carbon market, you decide. I'm delighted to be joined here by an incredibly esteemed panel of experts who are hailing from, I think, lots of different parts of the world tonight. I'm going to be up here all by my lonesome, so we'll have to have their presence manifest virtually this afternoon. I wanted to just take a minute to thank Governor Inslee for his incredible leadership over the course of what has been an extraordinary career in public service. We're very lucky to have someone who is so committed deeply to this set of issues. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Alexia Kelly. I'm the Managing Director of the Carbon Policy and Markets Initiative at the High Tide Foundation. For those of you who don't know the High Tide Foundation is a private philanthropy and family office that's focused exclusively on the climate crisis. It was founded by two wonderful people who have dedicated their considerable fortune and almost all of their waking hours to work full-time on solving the problem of climate change, and we're extraordinarily lucky that in the state of California, there's a lot of folks who fall into that category. I'm really looking forward to our discussion tonight, and it's been really great to be here over the course of the last couple of days. A lot of energy, a lot of excitement, and a lot of interest. I was talking the other day with someone at a dinner about deforestation in supply chains. There's a lot of talk about supply chains these days and within value chain mitigation. And they were saying that they were having such a hard time wrapping their arms around how to quantify the impact of the things that they were doing to try and reduce emissions across their supply chain. And I said, that's interesting. You know, what if we had a system that would enable us to look at a set of interventions, calculate the impact of those interventions, measure them over time, and then create something out of those that you could use to represent the impact of the things that you were doing to decarbonize your supply chain. And she looked at me and she said, that would be great, what is it? And I said, it's the carbon market. And she said, oh my gosh, you're right. So this room, the group of people here today and the expertise that we have assembled in this conference room and in this building, you are the ones who are doing the hard work day in, day out to figure out how to address the climate crisis and fight climate change in the real world. You're out there doing that hard work, you know, negotiating the deals, working with the landowners, engaging with the business owners, really putting this concept of harnessing the power of capitalism to address this crisis to work for us. So I just want to thank you all personally as well, just as Governor Inslee did, because the work that you're doing is hard, it's important, and we don't actually solve the climate crisis without lots more of us doing this good hard work. And this is what we're going to talk about in our panel tonight. I'm going to ask just our panelists really quickly to introduce themselves and say a few words about their incredibly impressive professional backgrounds, and provide a quick overview of the organizations that they represent. And then we're going to dive right into a discussion. We want this to be interactive, so we'll be coming to you, even though I can't see you, for questions fairly short order. So Annette, can I ask you to introduce yourself and say hello to the room?
Sure, hello room. I wish I could bring the energy that Governor Inslee brought to this. It's hard to do that in any circumstance, but certainly remotely is particularly difficult. But again, my name is Annette Nazareth. I'm the chair of the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. Alexia asked that we give a little bit of background on our experience. I was a former SEC commissioner, and before that, for 7 years, I ran the SEC's Division of Trading and Markets. So my background is in securities regulation. I oversaw the rules and regulations around securities exchanges, trading systems, broker-dealers, investment banks, clearing houses, and the like. So I've spent a lot of time in that. And before that, my career was focused on generally securities law and derivatives law and regulation.
Thank you so much,
And you
Annette.
want me to talk a bit about the Integrity Council? Should we dive
Yeah,
right
do you want to
into
just
that
say a
as
few
well?
words? Sure, that would be great, thank you.
A few words, sure. Well, obviously, the Integrity Council is something that I spend a great deal of time on now with Alexia and Mark and a great number of other people. We are an independent governance body for the voluntary carbon market, and our North Star is basically creating high integrity standards for carbon credits. As everyone, I'm sure, in this room knows, there's been a tremendous amount of inconsistency in the quality of credits, and that has a very deleterious effect on confidence in the market and trading in the market. And so with the help of an enormous group of very bright people, including a very esteemed board and expert panel members, we have created what we call our core carbon principles, which are 10 principles on which we believe high integrity carbon credits should be based. And obviously principles are a little too high level to actually implement, so we have an assessment framework that animates those principles, and we are in the process of applying and assessing carbon crediting programs as well as carbon methodologies against the core carbon principles, with the expectation that we'll be able to really seriously improve this market once the CCP labeled products can be issued.
Great, thank you, Annette. Mark, can I ask you to introduce yourself and say a few words about what the other part of the alphabet soup, the VCMI, is doing?
Yeah, thank you, Alexia, and greetings to everyone from Brighton, which, for those who don't know, is on the south coast of England, an hour south of London. And it is the middle of the night, but I'm delighted to be here. So I'm Mark Kenber. I've worked on market-based instruments for environmental protection for getting on for 30 years now, which is a scary thought in itself, and on carbon markets and related infrastructure for about 25 years. I was a co-founder of both the Gold Standard and Vera, standards that many of you probably use in your carbon credit purchases. I was involved in the design of the European Emissions Trading Scheme, and over those years have worked on and off on carbon markets. I'm currently the executive director of the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, VCMI, and as Annette mentioned, a member of the board of the ICVCM. So as Annette said, the ICVCM looks at creating a threshold standard that guarantees the quality of carbon credits and the projects from which they're delivered. VCMI looks at the demand side of the market, so answers the question, under what circumstances can companies credibly make use of carbon credits, and what can they credibly say about that use? That's the claims, all those claims that you will have heard over the last 20 or 30 years, carbon neutral, emissions neutral, carbon superhero, carbon positive, carbon negative, you name it, there's one out there, very badly regulated, very few people know what they mean. So the role of the VCMI is to provide some consistency and credibility to that, and I can talk about that a little bit later, and provide a way for companies to engage in this market, which needs engagement and needs demand, but in a way that helps them avoid the perils of greenwashing or being accused of greenwashing.
Great, thank you, Mark, and thank you so much for joining. It's almost midnight in England, so we appreciate you staying up so late to be with us tonight. Chris, wonderful to have you. Perhaps a less familiar face than Annette and Mark at some of these meetings. Would love to get a quick introduction from you about your background and tell the room a little bit about the GMCU.
Sure, thank you. Well, thank you for having me, and I'm sorry not to be there. I would like to be there and be able to read the crowd, because as you say, I'm probably an unfamiliar face, and the crowd is probably full of faces that need to be familiar to me but aren't yet. I'm the CEO of what we're calling the Global Carbon Market Utility, and I'll describe that in a second, but give you a bit of my background. I'm unfamiliar because my background involves very little about carbon markets. I, for 2 or 3 decades, have operated in different markets, more conventional markets, whether on Wall Street or studying them as an economist or as a risk manager for a major financial institution, and then working in the family office of George Soros on a variety of of projects, some of which had something to do with climate change and many others did not. So I come at this, as I said, with a lot to learn and with a comparative advantage that comes from more conventional markets. What the GCMU is proposing to do is to complement the work that the ICVCM and the VCMI are doing. The ICVCM will work and is working very hard, and I recommend the 133-page assessment framework to those of you who want to be convinced of how hard at work that team is, but working on integrity on the supply side of the market. And of course, Mark and his team with the VCMI is working on the integrity of the demand side. And our sense is that if this market is going to truly scale up, truly get an order of magnitude or two bigger than it is today, that we have to think about the integrity of the marketplace itself, the market structure itself. And so our modest proposal is to try to create the plumbing, the infrastructure, the connective tissue that will connect supply and demand, and hopefully do so that ensures that the marketplace itself is also governed by rules and data standards and disclosure requirements and the like that deliver the transparency, the auditability that is required for this market to grow. So that is our modest proposal.
Great, thanks so much, Chris, and really lovely to have you all here. We're going to dive right into the discussion. Annette, as a former SEC regulator, how do you see the role of the ICVCM in informing a more standardized and inclusive global benchmark for carbon credits?
Well, our core mission is really to establish, standards for high integrity carbon credits, and we've gone about it in a way that's very similar to how capital markets regulators would do that. You may know that, well, you would know because you're on our board, that the core carbon principles and the assessment framework were initially put out for full notice and comment, consistent with international standards. And we got, thousands of comments on various parts of the proposal from all manner of the ecosystem. And we took those all into account and then in a very transparent way came up with our final essentially quasi-rulemaking, which was the final CCPs and assessment framework, in which we basically also described what the comments had been and how we came out where we did. One of the things that's really, I think, very important about our process is that, we've all talked about the urgency of these issues. And, there's no right answer on any of this. And so it was very important for us to take the best thoughts, the best arguments, and come up with a threshold standard where we could start. So the CCPs are what we think today are best practice based on best science. But we have to aspire to more. And this is a moving target. And so we have been very clear that we will continue to curate our work, that every 2 or 3 years we intend to improve and basically ratchet up the requirements. We have work streams in place currently for continuous improvement work programs. And those processes are already, with your help, Alexia, already well underway. So we're going to continue to improve. We're going to continue to be transparent. We're going to continue, as I said, to curate these requirements. And obviously the assessments that we do of both the programs and the carbon methodologies will continue to be, critically important. And we will learn from those. I like to say that, as with any market, we know that when we start seeing trading with the CCP labels, it won't be perfect. It should be much better than where we are today. But with the what I like to call radical transparency that we're going to have, I'm sure we'll all see where there could be issues that will require further attention. And just as, you know, I saw when I was a markets regulator at the SEC, you see those issues, you address them, you determine whether they're isolated or systematic, and if they're more systematic, you take further steps. So I like to think that, you know, what we're doing here is really going to result in a much needed consistency and standardization in this market, with high integrity being the ultimate goal.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Annette. Those are such important points. In financial markets, when the rules get updated, what's the type of process that you would typically expect to see when the SEC changes key rules overall?
Well, it's similar to when the initial standards were put in place. It will be done through notice and comment. So we will issue our proposed changes. We will get comments, and we will be very transparent again about those comments and how we have assessed them, and then come out with the with the changes. So the same as we did with the initial proposals.
Yeah, and that standardization and certainty around when the rules change and the process by which they're going to be changed is so important for building, I think, capital markets confidence in investing and mobilizing resources into these markets specifically. Chris, I'm going to come to you because you worked in risk mitigation for a long time at Goldman Sachs. What are some of the key changes that you're seeing as being needed in the existing carbon markets to attract institutional investment capital?
Well, I think that that all of the players in the market now face some really difficult risk management challenges, which they need tools to manage much better and allow other players to come in so that this market can scale. I think I would distinguish between the risk management challenges of those who are investing in projects. Obviously, they face the radical uncertainty to go along with Annette's radical transparency about what the future size of this market will look like, because they're being asked to make important, substantial material investments in projects without a clear idea of what kind of revenues those projects can generate in the voluntary carbon market. So that's a fundamental source of uncertainty that they have to deal with. But even if they had a confident sense of what the market would look like, there are still other challenges that I think are really difficult to manage. One is that in the market today, it's still difficult to define and to delimit the risks in a transaction and where those risks reside and should reside. If that kind of parsing of risks were easier to undertake, then it would be easier to shift the different elements of risk around and to the balance sheet that can take those risks, absorb those risks the best. I think that's one of the reasons that many of the actors in the voluntary carbon market today are playing both the role of investor and the role of buyer. And their investments may be in the projects directly or indirectly by prepaying for future credits. And that's the case because that allows them to internalize a lot of the risks that in a much healthier, much bigger market could be contracted on a kind of arm's length basis. So if this market is to grow, I think we need to find ways of facilitating that kind of arm's length contracting rather than requiring companies to internalize them. We also need to figure out how to bring big financial intermediaries into this. If this is going to be a large financial market, there is no large financial market that doesn't have the large financial institutions playing different roles, whether it be market making or underwriting or financing or providing financial advisory services. And those financial institutions also need to understand how they can incorporate carbon credit trading and underwriting into their existing risk management models and frameworks. They need to figure out how to allocate capital that's mandated by bank regulators. They need to understand how auditing firms would apply accounting principles to audit these transactions. All of those remain question marks at the moment, and I think that that is making it difficult for the largest financial institutions to make a serious institutional commitment to this market.
Great, thank you. Mark, coming to you before you fall asleep on us. How has market response been to the recently announced VCMI labels, and in particular the announcement of the Scope 3 flexibility claim that has been long heralded as an important opportunity to help unlock additional demand in the market? Can you talk a little bit about what that claim looks like and the work that's underway currently to help operationalize that more broadly in the market?
Sure, let me start by just sort of framing or reframing the challenge. We know that we need companies, all companies across the world, to decarbonize very, very quickly. These numbers like 50% by 2030, certainly net zero by mid-century. We also know that there are a huge number of opportunities to reduce and remove emissions, particularly in developing countries, that require finance, and that carbon finance, carbon markets, is a really good way to do that. And a lot of that carbon finance, as Chris and Annette have suggested, is going to come from the private sector. So the challenge we face is how to encourage companies to invest in carbon markets, invest in carbon credits, use and retire them in a way that also incentivizes faster and deeper decarbonization. And the work of VCMI and our claims code is designed to do precisely that. We launched last year the carbon integrity claims, which are, for those who follow these things, what will be called beyond value chain mitigation claims. So things that companies do once they have either met their science-aligned targets or are demonstrably on track to meeting their next targets, be that in 2025, 2030, or whenever that may be. So having done that, they can then use carbon credits to go above and beyond that action and make what we've called carbon integrity claims. And there are carbon integrity silver, gold, and platinum claims, and the difference between the claims refers to how much of your remaining emissions a company has compensated by using carbon credits. And just 2 weeks ago, Bain & Company was the first company to make a platinum carbon integrity claim, which meant that not only was it on track to meet its science-aligned Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions reductions, but it had bought and retired carbon credits to cover all its remaining existing emissions. And we are expecting the next 2 or 3 companies to be announced over the next month, making carbon integrity claims, and we have an ambitious target to have many, many more by the end of this year. However, we also know that while there is a large and growing number of companies that have science-aligned targets, many through SBTI, there are a far greater number who don't yet have targets and haven't taken them on because they can't see a clear pathway to get there. And of those companies that have science-aligned targets, many are not on track to meet them. And so the conundrum that we face is, how do we encourage companies to go further and go faster and meet those targets, but when they can't, and they genuinely are making their best effort to fill the gap or bridge the gap between where they are and where they should be, using carbon credits. Mm-hmm. So just before the climate COP last year in Dubai, we announced a beta version of a Scope 3 flexibility claim. The research that we and others commissioned suggested that certainly over 50% and maybe as many as 3/4 of companies are struggling to meet their Scope 3 targets. And many of those would like to be able to bridge the gap using carbon credits. So we published this claim as a beta version to be able to test it this year. And we've just kicked off a program with nearly 90 companies who are helping us work through the claim. How does it work? Are the percentages the maximum number of credits that we said that we could be used, which was 50% of a company's reduction targeted in any year, declining over 10 years to come to zero by 2035. Is that the right initial number? Is that the right end date? Then also we have to compare companies' emissions with a trajectory of their emissions reductions pathway. And I mean, Alexia, you were part of these conversations. Sounds simple. Find me a company that has a linear emissions reduction pathway and I'll give you a medal. So it's, how do we work out the gap? how do we say, what are the right guardrails so that companies are not abusing it and saying, okay, well, I can buy credits cheap, so I'm not going to invest in my decarbonisation. But as I said before, how do we incentivize those investments in a way that also drive and accelerate decarbonisation? So if any companies in the room are interested in testing that without a commitment, companies that we're working with are doing it by and large anonymously, and we don't require public disclosure at this stage, but it's to really help us work through, along with other researchers and NGOs, to see how we can get this right. There is a huge opportunity out there. If the companies that are off track with their Scope 3 emissions filled that gap with carbon credits while doing everything they can to decarbonise, we could triple or quadruple the size of the carbon market immediately and grow it somewhere near some of those what may seem wild estimates of what the market be like in 2030, make those a reality rather than a dream.
Thanks for that, Mark. I think one of the big arguments against utilization of carbon credits as part of decarbonization pathways is that there's a fear that the companies will just purchase credits instead of investing in the decarbonization of their supply chains. There's actually been quite a bit of research on that set of topics recently. Could you talk a little bit about what that research is actually showing about company behavior who are participating in the carbon markets?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There is a suspicion or a supposition in the kind of the wider world that companies use carbon credits as a way of getting out or evading their responsibilities. But three pieces of research published last year suggested that that really wasn't the case. There were two that showed that companies that are using carbon credits as part of their net zero transition strategies are reducing their own emissions at twice the rate of those that are not. Now, this is a correlation. It doesn't explain the causality, but this was across statistically significant samples. And then deeper dives in this, particularly, for example, a report by Ecosystem Marketplace last year showed that companies that are engaged in voluntary carbon markets are outperforming their non-engaging in voluntary carbon market peers in the scale of their emission reductions and their investments. They are more likely to be engaging with their suppliers along their value chains. They are more likely to have science-based targets than those who do not engage with voluntary carbon markets. And they are more likely to have responsibility for climate change at the highest level in their management teams and across their board. So a number of indicators which should talk about climate leadership and climate action by corporates. On all those metrics, those who are already engaging with voluntary carbon markets perform better than those that don't, which seems to give the lie to the fact or the suggestion that companies engaging in carbon credits are trying to avoid responsibility and doing nothing. Quite the opposite. Those that are in carbon markets, and there are some fairly plausible reasons to why that might be the case, are actually going further faster.
Great, thank you so much. Chris, you had a long career in financial markets. Excuse me. Can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to make the jump into the voluntary carbon market and why you think it's such an important part of helping companies decarbonize?
One reason is so that I could look at my kids in the face and genuinely say that I'm doing something to make their world better than my world. I suspect that that's why everyone on the panel and everyone in the room there is here. But I also find this to be an incredibly challenging but an incredibly ingenious and fascinating way of unlocking the tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars that need to flow from pockets where they're burning a hole and burning fossil fuels to projects around the world that are avoiding or reducing or removing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. It's fairly clear to me that governments around the world have resources, but not nearly enough to address the challenge. And philanthropy has resources, but also not nearly enough. And so we have to unlock as many different sources of finance as we possibly can. And I think that the voluntary carbon markets, along with many other similar mechanisms, need to be part of the solution. For me personally, it is also an incredible challenge to be able to combine, what economists and financial experts tell us about how markets work what environmentalists and scientists tell us about how the atmosphere is changing with time, and how policymakers can think deeply and creatively about creating policy frameworks that can facilitate this. And this is really at the intersection of all three. And I think actually this panel itself is an embodiment of that intersection. And so that gives me hope and optimism. I had the benefit of listening to Governor Inslee as well, so I'm feeling a little bit inspired.
Yeah.
Alexia, I'd like to add to that because I think Chris put it extremely well. This is a great opportunity to bring expertise on markets and market structure, which Chris had referred to earlier, to our environmental challenge. And if we can do that effectively, we could really finally see some results. I mean, the fact that we could channel urgently needed finance to real high quality projects, often in the global south, that not only reduce or remove greenhouse gas emissions, but also, frankly, can really change those economies in very, very important and positive ways, if done correctly, with the proper focus on indigenous people and local communities and the like. But the thought that somehow this not only, again, can address the climate issues, but could potentially create generations of green-collar workers in communities, I find very, very compelling. And I like to tell people, when I got into this, I knew markets, but I didn't know this asset class. But I think in some ways, this is the most important asset class and the most important context of any that I feel I've worked on in my lifetime. And like Chris, I think, when you really consider the world that you're leaving to your children and ultimately grandchildren, nothing could be more important.
Yeah. Well, and Annette, you certainly fall into the category of people who had a long and storied career and could rightfully, be sitting drinking Mai Tais on the beach, and instead are also spending all of your waking hours fighting the good fight here. So we thank you so much for that. We're so lucky to have you at the ICVCM, and Chris and Mark as well. Such long histories. And that there's a lot of focus on emerging Paris compliant systems. You talked about the Global South. Unfortunately, I don't think we're having enough conversations about the Global South these days, but how are you starting to see the ICVCM kind of work show up? And Mark, I know VCMI is also doing a bunch of work on the country access strategies and engaging developing countries and emerging markets in kind of thinking through how they want to participate in the carbon markets. And so would love to hear, Annette, just a little bit about the uptake that you're seeing of the ICVCM CCPs and some of these emerging regulatory regimes. And Mark, maybe after that, if you could talk a little bit about the country access strategy work you guys are doing.
Yeah, we're very gratified with the uptake that we're seeing. By the time we got to Dubai, we were able to announce that carbon crediting programs representing 98% of retired credits had applied for the label, and that was very important. But equally important, we were able to show that we were getting a lot of uptake from countries and from regulators across the globe. Russ Benham from the Commodity Futures Trading Commission appeared with us at several programs. And as you know, before the COP28, the CFTC had issued proposed guidance, which was for exchanges that in the future could trade futures on carbon credits. And the thought was we have to be sure that those exchanges are actually trading products where they know that the underlying of the future has integrity. And there was reference to our CCPs, and frankly, all of the principles that the CFTC laid out were consistent. We had a few extras, but everything that they had was consistent with our CCPs. That was very important to us. We also had the UK government say that they were ready to officially endorse our work and were looking for places to reference our core carbon principles in UK regulation. We also have, seen the Monetary Authority of Singapore reference our work, and we're working with them on how they could make reference to our work. So we're seeing it, and of course the Africa Carbon Market Initiative also has referenced us. So that is incredibly important because, again, for those of us who care about efficient markets, if you can have a consistent standard, globally, it will really facilitate trading. It will facilitate, frankly, the buyer experience. I mean, if you know that no matter where you're buying a carbon credit, that it represents a certain standard, a certain consistent quality, that will make trading far better. But, and I say that obviously as a former regulator, I care about trading, but first and foremost, we care about the consistency of the high quality and integrity of the credit.
Yeah, thanks. Mark?
So, I only first just want to echo what Annette has said. I mean, in the conversations, we have as part of our work, a country contact group where we work with representatives from 50 countries, governments from around the world who advise us on our standards and on our work. And, there is broad agreement that having the ICVCM and high quality international standards for carbon credits is going to make a huge difference. But I think one of the things that countries say to us, or two things they say to us. One is, we want carbon finance to be an integral part of our net zero development strategies, our nationally determined contributions or climate prosperity plans. And so carbon finance is not just about financing a project which reduces or removes emissions and credits are sold. That's an important part of it. But it's how can that finance generate longer term, more transformational benefits? And so one of those is work we do through our Access Strategies program, where we work with governments and sectors around the world. We've done projects so far in Ghana, Kenya, in the Latin American agriculture sector, in water provision sectors around the world, looking at how carbon finance can leverage additional sources of capital and finance. So where can carbon finance fill gaps that wouldn't be filled otherwise? It could be reducing risk, it could be reducing the cost of capital, many different benefits it could have, and therefore leverage additional capital, access to technologies that countries wouldn't have otherwise. And that's all part of a bigger picture of not trying to avoid that carbon credits just become another commodity that countries compete with each other by, I'll give you an example that I often give to people. That I lived in Ecuador for many years, and Ecuador is on and off the largest banana exporter in the world. And many years ago, when there was lots of competition between banana exporting countries, when, say, Ecuador was doing well, other countries would say, well, we're losing out, so we're going to devalue our currency, weaken labor legislation, weaken environmental regulations, and then we'll capture more of the market. And so then it becomes a beggar thy neighbor policy, where the only people who benefit are those of us who buy bananas in supermarkets in England. And we don't really want to have that with carbon credits. And the point is not to have low quality, low cost banana or carbon credits in this case, but rather carbon credits that command a good value, a good price in the market, and drive transformational change. And this transformation change is not just about alignment with national strategies. It's also in the same way on the decarbonisation side by corporates, where when whole sectors start investing in technological change, you get system effects. We can see the same thing with carbon credit investments. Look at renewable energy projects in India, whether they be clean development mechanism projects or voluntary carbon market projects in the first decade of this century. There were lots of projects, they generated lots of credits, and lots of renewable energy was installed. But perhaps more importantly was the fact that you have, by some estimates, between 50 and 100,000 people now in India who know how to do solar project finance, know how to install solar plants, know how to do maintenance, know how to connect them to the grids, know how to connect them to batteries, know how to do grid reinforcement, know how to put policy in place that encourages renewable uptake. And that's a value that's often kind of forgotten about, but which countries are saying to us more and more. How do we use carbon finance to create those transformational and system-wide changes that then make it easier to decarbonize quicker with or without carbon markets?
Yeah, thanks so much. Chris, you worked for many years in emerging markets and risk mitigation strategy at Goldman. Do you have any additions from your perspective on some of the challenges that the market is facing in terms of really scaling up internationally and how we think about risk mitigation for institutional investors in particular in emerging economies?
Yeah. Well, I'd like to echo what both Annette and Mark have said, and I know Annette said that that efficiency is important, but not as important as other imperatives, and I agree with that. But it is also important, in particular, in respect of what we're talking about right now, because large, liquid, but more importantly, transparent and efficient markets mean fewer opportunities and fewer ways in which the intermediaries can extract rent along the way. Mm-hmm. And I think we know from many markets, most of them natural resource markets, that the capacity to extract rent can be extraordinary if you have a lack of transparency and inefficient markets. Someone is monetizing those inefficiencies, and so the GCMU's contribution, modest though it is, compared to the contributions of ICVCM and VCMI, is to try to create as many standardized contracts, standardized data requirements, centralized ledgers where this information can reside, so that these transactions can be fully audited according to accounting principles, and so that anyone who wants to understand what the cycle of that credit was from project all the way to retirement can very easily go to one place and understand it along every step of the way. Because I think that that's how you make sure that we don't simply replicate the resource curse that we've seen reproduced over and over again around the world in all sorts of different markets. It's critically important that we don't do that in this case. We know that carbon taxes and carbon prices have a tendency to be regressive, just because of the way in which poorer households and poorer countries consume fossil fuels more intensively compared to their analogs in richer countries. And we have to make sure that we do everything we can to offset that, but certainly not to exacerbate it. And so I think, transparency, scale, and efficiency will go not all the way there, but an important way towards delivering that.
Yeah, thanks. Super important points. I actually want to open it up for questions from the audience or comments or reflections on anything you've heard. Just raise your hand and we'll bring a mic to you. And I actually had another question for both of you. So Annette, the SEC ruling that recently came out makes third-party assurance all that much more important. I'm wondering if you could just say a few words about kind of how and if, and sorry to spring this on you, how and if the SEC rule will sort of change or impact the way we do business in the carbon markets.
Well, it's not clear to me how it'll change. I mean, the SEC rule was primarily a disclosure rule, right? So, and obviously, the more we understand about the emissions, of companies, the better. But as you know, the rule has already been stayed. It's been challenged in court, and we're not going to see it in place. So I think having that data would be very helpful, because the more we understand about emissions, the better companies will be able to respond. But I think we have a real problem in terms of whether or not we're going to see it actually implemented.
Yeah, thanks. Anything to add?
Can I add, Alexia, just a footnote, and I'm curious to know whether Annette sees it the same way, but clearly there'll be litigation, and we won't know what the final rule looks like for some time, maybe not just months, but years. But I think the SEC, having issued this rule, makes it clear, if it wasn't clear already, for many large corporations that disclose in the United States, that this is not just the responsibility of the chief sustainability officer in the company, but also the CFO and the general counsel and the CEO. And I would like to think that that will make a difference, that that will make these companies realize that they have to make an even more aggressive commitment to put their money where their mouth is, as it were, and be absolutely clear about what they're saying to the world, and make sure that it's accurate.
Yeah.
I definitely agree with that. I think what the SEC tried to do, as you know, was to standardize the disclosure. Because what we have today is, I mean, a great number of companies do disclose climate as a material risk, right? But they don't all do it in the same way. And it's very difficult when you have, I mean, just as we've been talking about standardization of carbon credits through, the core carbon principles, likewise, the more standardized disclosure is, the more helpful it is to be able to compare across companies. And that's really what we're going to lose. But I agree. I think the focus on these climate issues, I think that companies would be hard pressed at this point not to be making disclosure about their climate risks. Mm-hmm. The question is, how standardized would that can that disclosure be in the absence of rules?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Any questions or comments from the audience?
Yeah, we have a question back here, Alexia.
Great. Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you so much for a wonderful panel. My name's Henry Kronk. I'm a reporter with Opus, where I serve as the carbon markets editor. There was a panel just this afternoon where many panelists reflected maybe what we could call a growing idea that many of the efforts that you all are involved with place too many restrictions on companies that are buying carbon offset credits to decarbonize. Chris, you mentioned a big goal right now is we need to bring more investment into this space. One quote from a panelist was, it should be up to corporates to decide how to use offsets. Do you sympathize with that perspective, and how do you respond?
Is you Chris, or is you the panel? Well, I'll assume it's Chris and then the panel. I think we all have to recognize one fundamental characteristic about this market that makes it very different from almost any market I know of. And that is that this is a market in which what is being transacted, bought and sold, it's a good in which a buyer cannot discern the quality of the good simply by buying it. In the same way you can determine whether what you bought at the supermarket was high quality or low quality. And so I think that characteristic makes it critically important for VCMI and ICVCM to be playing the role that they're playing, because this is a case in which corporates really can't be left to their own devices in determining what they buy and what they do with what they buy. We, of course, want the universe of possible transactions and possible credits and possible buyers to be as large as possible. That's what we need for this market to scale up. But I think that there's a critical need for fiduciaries to play a role in this market that are not necessarily needed in other more conventional markets. And I think that's why what the panelists here are working on is so critically important for this market.
So if I just follow up on that, I can understand why one of the earlier panelists may have made that comment, but I think that they are mistaken. So the reason the VCMI has put out guidance, and let's remember we're not a regulator. We like to think of ourselves as a quasi-regulator, but we're putting out guidance and claims that companies can make in the market. And we do that to encourage companies who want to do this in what we would think of as the right way. So as I said before, where use of carbon credits complements and accelerates decarbonisation. So we're getting both and, not one instead of the other. But a reason for doing that is not only to exclude companies who are making claims about their environmental performance on the basis only of carbon credits, but it's to encourage, to help those who want to do it right. And the risks are not being posed by organizations like VCMI or ICVCM or GCMU. Just this week, KLM, a Dutch court, found KLM guilty of misleading the public by making claims about its environmental performance, the climate performance of its airline, and what it was telling its customers that its offsets were doing in terms of reducing the climate impact of flights. And that was found as being a misleading claim. So what VCMI is trying to do is, by providing clear guidance, language that has been legally tested, that has been tested with stakeholders, so that companies can use when they talk about how they use the carbon credits, is to provide protection and therefore we hope encouragement and incentivize more engagement with carbon markets rather than less. We are in a position where there are a lot of doubts. There has been, as Annette mentioned in the case of carbon credits, in the same way the use of carbon credits themselves in the past has not been uniform. There have been those who've done it very well and those who have not done it as well. And it's important that we encourage more of those who are doing it properly, and that will drive demand.
Well said. Well, with that, Craig gets the final word, and then we'll close.
Craig Ebert, Climate Action Reserve. I honestly want to push back on that answer and rephrase it in a certain way. When Annette and the rest of her team at ICVCM is successful in establishing what quality and integrity means in the market, why do we need additional restrictions on corporate investment in the carbon market? Specifically, and Mark, maybe this is more directed at you, but there are a lot of questions around just the focus on scope 3, everything from the difficulty of estimating it, the amount of resources it takes, the ability to a lot of companies feel to modify their supply chain, frankly, the lack of guidance over how to account for that, which ultimately is some type of crediting mechanism built into it, and the reality that it's a cost-inefficient approach, that as long as companies have the guardrails for investing in high-integrity credits of whatever sort, why not let them decide what their overall strategy should be? What makes the carbon market fundamentally different than any other commodities market?
So thanks, Craig, for the question. And you know, I've had this conversation before, probably in private, not on a screen. But look, I think as I said at the beginning, it's not a question. The question we're not facing is, do we do corporate decarbonisation or do we do investment in carbon markets? We need both. We've been negotiating internationally on climate change since 1988. That's 36 years. And emissions are still higher than they've ever been before. So we're not acting quickly enough, and we're not acting decisively enough. And so, whereas 25 years ago, we might have been able to say, well, let's have a more flexible approach. Now we need everything all at once. And so that's part of the reason we put such an emphasis on both the decarbonisation and the investment in carbon credits. And I tried to sort of make in an earlier comment the point that both of those at scale have systemic effects. So if you have a large number of the major companies in the steel industry all investing in cutting-edge new decarbonising technologies, then you get economies of scale, you get change happening more quickly, and you get change across the system. And even those who aren't directly investing will benefit and will take up the new technologies because they will be either more competitive or they'll be regulated. As we're seeing that with electric vehicles, I think just in the US I saw today, new requirement for how many new vehicles have to be electric vehicles in the next 10 or 15 years. And so that's a requirement not on car manufacturers to buy loads of carbon credits. It's to develop the technology that will decarbonize the transport system. And above and beyond that, we want them to invest in carbon markets. So there are systemic effects on both parts of it, and we need to encourage both of them. So while, Craig, I certainly take your point about if you've got to give an objective, why achieve it more expensively if you can achieve it more cheaply? But here we're talking about multiple objectives, which we need to attack all at the same time. So we need both and, not one or the other.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. We're certainly at everything, everywhere, all at once moment in the climate crisis. So we so appreciate everyone joining us today. Thank you to NACW for the wonderful conference. Thank you to our panelists, especially to Mark. You can go to bed now. And we will look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Thanks, Alexia. Thank you for the panelists for that. Mark, I hope that question doesn't put you in a bad mood going to sleep. Thanks for staying up. And again,
Not at all.
another round of applause for the great panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.